What stands between a felled forest and a plowed field? The tree is gone. The lumber company cut it down. They hauled the trunk away on a log sled or a Decoville rail car or a river drive and sent it to the sawmill. The white pine and the hardwood and the hemlock were milled into boards and shipped to Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, and St. Louis. The lumber company made its money and moved on. The tree is gone, but the stump is still there, 2 to 4 feet in diameter, roots extending 6 feet deep into clay soil in every direction, anchored into the earth by a root system that spent 80 to 200 years growing into rock and subsoil and glacial till. The stump cannot be plowed around, the stump cannot be planted through, the stump cannot be ignored, and there are not 1 or 2 stumps on the acre. There are 200 to 500, depending on the density of the original forest, and the lumber company left every one of them in the ground when it left. I went looking for the machine that solved this problem. What I found was a cast iron capstan bolted to a timber frame, anchored to the ground by a chain wrapped around the nearest standing tree or the heaviest remaining stump, connected to the target stump by a steel cable threaded through a snatch block, and powered by a horse walking in a circle, round and round and round the capstan, winding the cable 1 revolution at a time, pulling the stump from the earth with a force that could reach 30 tons at the point of extraction. The machine weighed approximately 800 pounds. It was called a stump puller, and it was the machine that turned the American Cutover, 40 million acres of stripped forest land across the upper Midwest, from a field of stumps into the most productive agricultural landscape on the planet. The cable that connected the stump puller to the stump held the full force of the extraction. When a root system broke loose suddenly, or when the cable caught a hidden rock and jumped, or when the cable frayed on a sharp edge of the snatch block and parted under 30 tons of tension, the released energy turned the steel cable into a whip. The operator was standing over it. The horse was standing beside it. The county agricultural extension offices across Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and the upper Midwest documented the injuries in their field reports. The injuries are in the records. The names of the men who were struck by the cable when it snapped are not in any history of American agriculture that I have been able to find. The story starts with the forest. Before European settlement, the upper Midwest of the United States was covered in dense forest. The region that is now Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the northern reaches of Illinois and Indiana supported an estimated 30 million acres of forest in Wisconsin alone, covering roughly 3/4 of the state's land area. The trees were white pine, red pine, hemlock, American beech, sugar maple, yellow birch, basswood, and oak. The white pine grew 100 to 150 feet tall and 4 to 6 feet in diameter. The hardwoods formed a dense canopy that covered the ground in permanent shade. The soil beneath the forest was rich, black, and deep, built from thousands of years of leaf litter and root decay deposited onto glacial till left behind by the Laurentide ice sheet 10,000 years before. The lumber companies saw the trees, the farmers saw the soil. Neither of them saw the stumps as anything other than a temporary inconvenience between the forest that was and the farm that would be. The stumps turned out to be neither temporary nor inconvenient. They were the single largest obstacle to agricultural development in the history of the Midwest. The lumber industry arrived in the upper Great Lakes region in the 1850s and cut steadily for 50 years. The pace of the harvest was extraordinary. Wisconsin's forests alone shrank from 30 million acres to approximately 17 million acres between the 1850s and the 1930s. By 1910, the lumber companies had stripped the Great Lakes states of their white pine, leaving behind a 40 million acre expanse of cutover land that stretched across northern Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. The term cutover entered the regional vocabulary as a specific geographic and economic designation, land that had been logged, stripped of its commercial timber, and abandoned by the company that had cut it. The lumber companies took the trees and left everything else. The slash, the tops and branches left on the ground after logging dried in the sun and became tinder. The stumps sat in the soil, hundreds per acre, their root systems intact. their wood slowly hardening as the resinous pine stumps cured in place. Pine stumps in particular could persist in the ground for decades without rotting because the resin in the wood resisted decay. A white pine stump cut in 1880 could still be solid and rooted in 1920, 40 years later, as immovable as the day the tree was felled. The land companies and the railroads and the state agricultural agencies saw opportunity in the cutover. The soil was good, the water was plentiful, the climate was suitable for dairy farming and hay and potatoes and oats. The land was practically free. The Oneida County government in Wisconsin offered 30,000 acres of abandoned cutover land at 50 cents an acre, 160 acres for $80. The Rhinelander weekly newspaper, The New North, promised a glorious future. The community's well-being does not depend on its timber, the paper assured its readers in 1900. Stock raising and dairying held great promise. All the farmer had to do was clear the stumps. When E.L. Luther, a University of Wisconsin agricultural extension agent, arrived in Oneida County to begin his assignment, he wrote a letter home from the train. The letter described the landscape he could see through the window as the train crossed the cutover. The letter contained one word that he spelled out in capital letters for emphasis. S-T-U-M-P-S. Durn the stumps. Yonder is a pile of stumps. So some are pulled for me. Luther had singled out the pine stumps as his most hated enemy before he even arrived. He was right to hate them. The stumps made straight-line plowing impossible. They blocked the path of every piece of horse-drawn farm equipment. They made planting in rows impossible. They made harvesting with a mechanical reaper impossible. A field full of stumps was not a farm. It was an obstacle course. And every acre of the 40 million acre cutover was full of them. If your family homesteaded in the cutover, if your grandparents cleared the land in Wisconsin or Michigan or Minnesota with a horse and a chain and a machine that they bought from a catalog or borrowed from a neighbor, if there is a photograph in your family's collection of a stump puller sitting in a field of torn earth with a horse standing beside it, subscribe if you want to see what I find next in these records. The stump puller was not invented in a single moment by a single person. It evolved through dozens of patents and hundreds of blacksmith shop modifications across the second half of the 19th century. The earliest commercial models appeared in the 1860s. The Pioneer stump puller, patented in 1867, is preserved as a scale model in the collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. The model was used by traveling salesmen to demonstrate the machine's operation to prospective customers, farmers who needed to see the mechanics of the device before they would invest in one. By the 1880s and 1890s, the stump puller had reached its mature commercial form. The major manufacturers included the Hercules Manufacturing Company of Centerville, Iowa, the Swenson Grubber Company, which began as the Faultless Stump Puller Company of Cresco, Iowa, founded in 1895 by John Swenson and his father Lawrence, and the Monarch Company, which produced the Monarch No. 6 stump puller. The Hercules No. 2, a horse-powered model, weighed approximately 800 pounds and was made of cast iron and forged steel. It was shipped, disassembled, and assembled on site. The machine operated on a capstan principle, the same mechanical concept used in ship anchoring and in the windlasses that raised heavy loads in construction. The stump puller consisted of a heavy cast iron capstan drum mounted vertically on a timber or steel base frame. The base frame was anchored to the ground by a chain or cable run to the nearest solid object, a standing tree, a large remaining stump, or a buried timber deadman anchor driven into the soil. A steel cable was wound onto the capstan drum, run out across the field to a snatch block, a heavy pulley that redirected the pulling force, and from the snatch block to a chain or cable wrapped around the target stump. The snatch block was anchored to another tree or stump between the puller and the target. The horse was hitched to a sweep arm that extended horizontally from the top of the capstan. The horse walked in a circle around the machine, pulling the sweep arm, which rotated the capstan drum, which wound the cable, which tightened through the snatch block, which pulled the chain wrapped around the stump. Each revolution of the horse around the capstan wound another wrap of cable onto the drum. The mechanical advantage of the capstan, multiplied by the pulley ratio of the snatch block, converted the steady walking pull of a single draft horse into an extraction force at the stump that could reach 30 tons. 30 tons! From a horse walking in a circle. The stump resisted, the roots held, The cable tightened. The horse kept walking. The capstan kept turning. The earth around the stump began to crack. The clay lifted. The lateral roots, which could extend 6 to 8 feet in every direction, started tearing free of the subsoil one by one, each release accompanied by a deep sound from the ground that the farmers described as a groan or a tearing. The taproot, if the stump had one, was the last to let go. When the taproot snapped, the entire stump came free of the earth in a single violent motion, lurching upward and sideways, trailing a tangle of torn roots and clay, and the cable went slack. The operator unhooked the chain from the stump, dragged the stump to the edge of the clearing or to a burn pile, and moved the cable to the next stump. The horse turned around and walked in the other direction to unwind the cable and reposition the system. In 1915, a series of tests conducted under the supervision of the University of Minnesota measured the output of a Hercules stump puller in soft timber. 3 men and a horse team cleared 5 acres and 1,261 stumps in 9 days. That is 140 stumps per day. That is 1 stump every 3.5 minutes during a 10-hour working day. In hardwood, in heavy clay, the rate was slower. Large oak and maple stumps with root systems that had been growing for a century or more could take an hour each to extract. A single acre of dense hardwood cutover might contain 300 to 500 stumps. At 15 to 20 stumps per day in heavy ground, 1 acre took 2 to 4 weeks. A 160-acre homestead in the cutover could take a family years to clear, working stump by stump, acre by acre, with 1 machine, 1 horse, and the labor of every member of the household old enough to handle a chain. The cable was the danger. The steel cable that connected the stump puller to the stump through the snatch block carried the full force of the extraction at every point along its length. When the force on the cable reached 30 tons and a root released suddenly, the instantaneous slack in the cable created a whip effect. The cable jumped off the ground, moving at a speed proportional to the stored energy, and anything or anyone in the path of the cable's arc was struck with the force of a steel whip under thousands of pounds of tension. When the cable itself broke, the parted end recoiled toward the machine at lethal velocity. The operators of the stump puller worked within the radius of the cable's sweep. They stood over the cable to attach and detach the chains from each stump. They stood near the snatch block to reposition it. They stood beside the capstan to manage the winding. Every one of these positions was within the killing radius of a cable failure. The injuries followed a pattern. A cable snapped or a stump released and the cable whipped across the operator's body. The steel wire cut through clothing and flesh. Broken legs, broken arms, severed fingers, lacerations deep enough to reach the bone. The county agricultural extension records across the cutover states documented these injuries in their field reports. In the same files where they tracked crop yields and soil conditions and dairy production, the stump pulling injuries were treated as agricultural data. The men who were struck by the cables were listed as incidents, not as casualties. The injuries are in the records. The names of the men are recorded in the extension files and in the county hospital admissions. They are not recorded in any memorial or any published history of American agriculture. The horse was also at risk. A cable snap could strike the horse in the legs, the chest, or the head. A stump that released suddenly while the horse was at full pull could jolt the animal forward and off its feet. Draft horses were valuable, more valuable in many cases than the stump puller itself, and the loss of a horse to a cable injury could set a homesteading family back financially by a year or more. Farmers learned to keep the horse on the far side of the capstan from the cable, to use longer sweep arms that placed the animal outside the direct arc of a snap, and to watch the cable constantly for signs of fraying or strain. These adaptations reduced the risk. They did not eliminate it. The cable was always under tension, the stumps always released unpredictably. The danger was structural to the operation. By 1911, a second method of stump removal had become widespread. Alongside the puller, Dynamite, E. Dupont de Nemours published a handbook called Farming with Dynamite. The Hercules Powder Company and the Atlas Powder Company published their own guides. By 1911, approximately 250,000 American farmers were using dynamite for agricultural purposes, primarily stump and boulder removal. The method was to bore a hole beneath the stump using an iron bar or an auger, pack dynamite cartridges into the hole at a rate of 1/2 to 1 stick per inch of stump diameter, insert a blasting cap and fuse, tamp the hole with loose earth, pay out enough fuse to reach a safe distance, light the fuse, and run. The detonation cracked the stump and broke the root system. The shattered remains were then pulled by horse or by hand. In Wisconsin and Michigan, the county agricultural agents organized land clearing demonstrations that combined dynamite and stump pulling. The dynamite cracked the stump. The puller extracted the broken pieces. The combination was faster than either method alone. The demonstrations drew crowds of farmers who stood at what they hoped was a safe distance and watched the stumps explode from the ground, the dirt and splinters rising 50 feet into the air, the concussion rolling across the flat Cutover landscape, and then the horse-powered puller dragging the shattered root mass to the burn pile. The University of Wisconsin Extension Office documented these demonstrations in photographs and in bulletins distributed to county agents across the state. The bulletins described the technique in clinical detail. They did not describe what happened when a farmer working alone without an extension agent's supervision misjudged the amount of dynamite, failed to tamp the hole, or used fuse that had been stored improperly. The accidents are in the county records. The dynamite was available at general hardware stores across the Midwest. No license was required. The 40 million acres of cut-over land in the upper Great Lakes states were cleared over a period of roughly 50 years, from the 1880s through the 1930s. The process was not organized or centralized. It was carried out farm by farm, family by family, stump by stump, by individual homesteaders and tenant farmers and land speculators and dairy operators who bought or were given cut-over land and then faced the physical reality of converting it from a field of stumps into a working farm. The stump puller was the primary tool for this conversion. Every manufacturer shipped machines into the cutover by rail and by catalog. The machines sat in fields across Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota for decades, rusting in place after the last stump was pulled, their cast iron capstans sinking into the soil they had helped clear. Many of them are still there. Antique equipment collectors and agricultural museums across the upper Midwest preserve Hercules and Monarch and Faultless stump pullers in their collections. The Western Antique Aeroplane and Automobile Museum in Hood River, Oregon, has one on display outside its entrance. I started with a question: what stands between a felled forest and a plowed field? The answer is 200 to 500 stumps per acre, with root systems 6 feet deep in glacial clay, across 40 million acres of cutover land left behind by the lumber companies that stripped the Great Lakes states of their white pine and their hardwood and their hemlock between 1850 and 1910. The machine that removed those stumps was an 800-pound cast iron capstan powered by a horse walking in circles, winding a steel cable through a snatch block onto a drum, pulling each stump from the earth with up to 30 tons of force, one stump at a time, 15 to 20 per day in heavy ground, with the operator standing inside the arc of a cable that could snap at any moment and kill him. The machine cost less than $100. The horse cost more. The land cost 50 cents an acre in Oneida County, Wisconsin. The labor cost everything the family had for as long as it took to clear the field. The lumber companies that cut the trees are documented in the corporate records, in the shipping manifests, and in the sawmill ledgers of the cities that consume the wood. The railroads that carried the lumber are documented. The land companies that sold the cut-over acreage to the farmers are documented. The agricultural extension agents who organized the land clearing demonstrations, published the bulletins, and photographed the stump pullers at work are documented by name. The farmers who bought the machines, hitched the horses, wrapped the chains around the stumps, stood over the cables, and pulled the stumps from the ground one at a time until the field was clear enough to plow, acre by acre, year by year, across 40 million acres of cutover are in the county records, in the census, and in the property deeds. They are not in any history of the machines that built the Midwest. The breadbasket was not given. It was pulled from the ground, one stump at a time, by a horse walking in a circle. There are more of these stories. More machines, more furnaces, more men who went into the dark and came out different, or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how a mine fire that started with a trash burn before Memorial Day has been burning beneath a Pennsylvania town for 64 years with no way to stop it, that video's on screen now.